Hi, folks. Hi. Okay, so I'm Gabriel Bassett. I'm one of the co-authors for the 2019 DBIR. Who here knows what the report is? Like, okay, who's read it cover to cover? Yeah. Who's skimmed the pictures? Yeah, there's the high point in the curve. You know, who's like read the headlines and knows that stuff? Like, yeah, we understand that, and that's why we put so much effort into the pictures. I particularly like that because I'm the one who does most of the figures. So if there's figures you liked, you can thank me for them. If there are figures that are incredibly weird, I'll apologize for those later in the talk. But I'm not the only author. These are the other 4 authors. And so there are lots of people at Verizon that claim to be DBIR authors. There are very few actual authors. Dave Highlander, Suzanne Weidup, Mark Spittler, who led the team, and Alex Pinto, who's taken it over, were the authors for this year's report. And then we're adding Phil Langlois to the team as well for the 2020 report. And so, by the way, I'm going to talk to a couple of lists of cool things to fix, things to pay attention to. This link goes to a presentation that has those things listed out because I'm not going to put them in the charts. Like I said, I do figures, and so I've got lots of pictures and lots of bar graphs and things like that on my charts, and no lists of text. And so if you want lists of text, which I always like lists of text, take a picture of this. I'll come back to it later. It'll be at the end of the talk while we're taking questions. So if you miss it when I switch off of it here in a second, it's not a big deal. And so what the DBR is, we all kind of heard about, but just to repeat, from like a decade ago, when we looked at data about security, a lot of times it was anecdotal. It was whatever the most recent breach was. Everyone went out and tried to go fix that problem, as if that problem was everyone's problem. And a couple of guys, Dave, Wade, Peter Tippett, said, you know what, let's go and look at a set of data and like do some actual analysis around this and come up with a data-driven report. And since then, we've continued to add authors, add contributors, add data, and with the main goal of reducing bias and improving context in our report, but always as data-driven as possible. You know, we want to be able to tell people what the normal organization should see and how that they can react to it and what they can do about it. And so to get a couple of things out of the way first, one, the majority of breaches are externally motivated. The actors are almost always external. And this is because we always hear like, oh, it's an insider, you got to worry about the insider and things like that. And that's not what the data says. In fact, the reason internal is going up is not because insiders are all evil people, it's because we've started actually reporting when people make errors internally. These are errors, these are mistakes, they're not malicious. And so the reality is the majority of what you have to worry about is external. The other one is espionage versus financially motivated. Most people, we love to hear about espionage-motivated breaches, right? Because they're so cool and they're exciting and they do fancy things. And the reality is they're not that much. They're a very small percentage, or about 25% of breaches. The vast majority are financially motivated. The attackers that are coming after you are more than likely financially motivated. And this is incredibly important. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, this is what I want you to take away. Is that most threat actors want just the easy, they want the easiest way. And this is important for you because this means that you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be a little better than worst. Because those guys are financially motivated. And all they need to do, like, they want to get the greatest return on their investment. And if they want that return on investment, they can't be spending a lot. And so they're going to take the absolute easiest way to get it. And the reality is that's 85% of breaches. And so let's talk about the 4 horsemen of breaches. They are patching, errors, social attacks, and credentials. And we'll talk about each of these individually, starting with patching. And when I say patching, I don't mean like your normal, like trying to get everything patched perfectly. I mean like try to patch that thing that's facing the internet and is 10 years old. Like the bar is low. It's really not that high because the attackers are not going after that advanced stuff necessarily, not in bulk. They're going after the obvious stuff. And so what this is, it's the rank ratio of honeypot data to internet scan data. And so what we're talking about is Telnet is the #1 most common port for attackers to hit on honeypots. It is only the 15th most likely port to be on the internet. And so these are the highest ratios, and if you look at these are obvious things. Like, these are vulnerabilities, but they're not like last year's vulnerabilities, they're last decade's vulnerabilities. And so these are the things you need to patch. You need to, like, it'd be nice if we all got everything patched every week. It'd be good if we got it patched every month. But like, if you could get things patched after a couple years, or maybe just like throw a firewall on it, that'd be great. Like, that would actually do something about the attackers. But to be able to do that is not just about patching, it's also about asset management. You need to know what assets you have facing the internet. And so you need to have discovery. And I think a lot of times for the people in this room who are probably already patching at least something, that's probably the big part, is understanding what you have. Now, the next part are errors. So who here is spending a portion of their security budget to fix errors and to mitigate errors? That's like a few. That wasn't even like the number, right? That's like just a few hands, kind of. Who's spending 20% of their security budget to fix errors? Yeah, no one, right? We might be spending 20% of our security budget to fix vulnerabilities, but certainly not errors. And vulnerabilities in the DBIR lead to at most 6% of the breaches. Let that sink in. Versus 21% for errors. Errors lead to a lot of breaches. And so system admin down here is trending up as an actor. The reason system admin is trending up as an actor, admins make mistakes. And they're the ones that get blamed when cloud storage is left on the internet and is exposed, or when databases are exposed to the internet and become breaches. And it's not that we're getting worse at errors. What it is that we're now actually talking about them. And we've known this for a while, because in the DBIR, if you look, the public sector and healthcare, who have mandatory reporting requirements, always report really high percentages of errors. Just now, the standard has become that when you go, and as a security researcher, if you find that database sitting on the internet, you go tell the company, and then you go tell a news organization. It gets published publicly, and when it gets published publicly, we can put it into our data set, we can find it easily. And so because of that, it's trending up as a report, but the reality is errors are happening a lot. And so the question is, what are you going to do about it? And so the plan needs to be to fail gracefully. After this talk, I need to drive back to Nashville. And on the drive back, if my tire springs a leak, I don't expect my car to explode. But that happens, right? We have a breach, and all of a sudden, like, some minor thing didn't get configured right, and becomes this big breach of tens or millions of records. It's ridiculous. So we need to go and look at the data we have inside our organization and say, what would happen if this data was breached? Is this data that would become a significant issue if some error exposed it? And then we need to look at the people and the processes and the systems that touch it. Because the reality is, and I try to get this through every single presentation I do, no people, no processes, no systems, no security tools are perfect. Nothing you deal with is perfect. So you need to plan for it to fail, for it not to work the way you expect. And it's necessary to prepare for that. And it's okay, it's natural, it's normal, but you need to be prepared for those failures. And so that means understanding how the systems will fail that touch our data, and when they do fail, having a plan. And you don't have to develop this on your own. Process improvement has been around for a long time. We just don't do a good job of applying it to security. And so go look at those process improvement systems that are already in place and see how you can apply them to your security processes that deal with data. That way, all that spending you're doing on vulnerabilities doesn't get wasted when someone accidentally puts the database on the internet, and that becomes your breach. Excuse me. Okay, now let's move on to the fun stuff, social engineering. Social attacks, and we're going to talk about this in 2 slides. Social attacks kind of come in 2 different flavors. The first will be financially motivated social engineering attacks, and this is my favorite quote from the entire report this year, was that you have to hand it to the attackers. At some point, one must have thought, why don't we just skip all the hard hacking stuff and just ask for the money? And it works. In fact, we started to call these business email compromises in the report, and then we started to decide we had to call them financially motivated social engineering attacks because you don't actually have to breach an email address. You literally can email from an external address and say, hey, will you give me money? I promise you I'm the CFO. And you're like, sure, whatever. It happens, and it happens so much. And why are executives the ones that are targeted? Executives are the ones that can transfer money easily. And I sympathize with this. Because, right, it's like, no one would ever send money around. And then, like, we're getting ready for B-Sides Las Vegas, and I'm the CFO for a nonprofit, and the CEO goes, hey, you know, I had this other guy print out some stickers for me. I need you to send him some money to reimburse him. I'm like, okay. Like, I'm going to end up in my own data set when I do this, you know? Because I'm doing the same thing, and I completely understand where it comes from. But the reality is you need to be prepared to handle these types of situations, because it's not even a large breach that causes, or not a large amount of money that normally gets transferred. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's like $24,000 is the median. And so you may have a process for dealing with that transfer of $100,000 or $1 million, but do you have a process for that $24,000? Because that's the one that normally happens. And second is social attacks. And so if financially motivated social engineering is the nice quick one, phishing is the very common one. And the reality is we're getting better at clicking stuff. This is phishing testing data, so when they send you phishing, and it's coming down. But still, we're hovering around 20% or more of breaches involving phishing. And you kind of wonder, how in the world does this happen? But a good example is my wife over Labor Day was, we're out at my brother-in-law's cabin on the lake. So she's down on this really nice dock that goes out a ways, and she's fishing, but she's fishing along the shoreline. And now, I'll bet, this is a big lake, out in the middle of that lake, I'll bet there's a bunch of big, nice fish, like ones you can really be proud of. In fact, it may be that 75 or 97% of the fish are out in the middle of the lake. But right up there along the bank, there's more than enough bluegill to keep her happy for the entire day. And that's the reality for fishing, right? Even though the majority of people may be out in the middle of the lake, there's certainly enough people along the bank to keep the people that are attacking happy. And so what can you do about this? Well, for financially motivated social engineering or business email compromises, you need to have a process for having an out-of-band method for confirming money transfers. And any money transfer that goes beyond what you're willing to lose, because right, the median breach is not high. And for phishing, there's a lot we can do. We know that the majority of breaches that come by phishing, they come as links in emails, executable attachments, or macro-enabled Office documents. So filter those things when coming through your email. Like, I mean, some people get links, but like we're starting to get better trained about doing that. We shouldn't get links by email. Second, none of us are getting our Windows updates by email. Like, no one emails you the executable windows.exe, and you're like, this is a good idea. And macro-enabled Office documents, there's probably someone in your company who needs to use them, but find that person, let them do it, and no one else needs to be using it. Have a process, and then give people a way to report, because the reality is that the majority of reports of phishing emails are going to come in the first hour, but only a third of the clicks. Then the next third come in over the day, and then the next third come in over the week. And so potentially, if you're acting on the reported phishing, you can stop 2/3 of the phishing emails from getting through. And finally, set people up for success, right? Because as IT people, it's very easy for us to say, oh, I can't believe those people click links in their emails. I would never open that attachment. You know, the reason is because no one sends you a PDF blindly. Like, if I get a PDF blindly, I don't open it because that's not something people do to me. On the other hand, if you're in public relations and someone says, hey, we're running this story about your organization next week, would you like to comment? You're opening that PDF right away. If you're in the legal department, you're going to open that attachment. People in your organization need to be able to open attachments, and so set them up for success. For those portions of the organization, they probably don't need a normal full laptop. You know, give them a sandboxed operating system on a tablet or something so that they can open attachments and such without feeling the stress of whether they're going to be seeing the security people show up at their door the next day, because they're going to do it anyway. You know, set them up for success. And then finally, the fourth. Okay, do we remember what the other three were? What's the first one? Who said it first? Over here? Okay, here, I have gifts. Here. You pass this back to him? Thanks. Now, I'll have questions later on that I'll give gifts from. But what was the second one? There's good. And what was the third one? Great, and credentials is the fourth. And the biggest. 29% of breaches started with who here knows what credential stuffing is? Yeah. random amount. Credential stuffing is when the attackers take a big body of credentials and they try them against everything. In fact, like a couple of years ago, they found like 5 billion credentials on some foreign file server that were being used for this. And they try them against everything. They try them against financial institutions, against retail sites, against like your cloud email or your cloud infrastructure, and even directly against your organization. And they work. They get the attackers in. And this goes back to that financial process, because if I'm saying I want to go make money being a hacker, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go buy some credentials, I'm going to log in to whoever that organization is, and whatever that login directly gives me access to, I'm going to go monetize. If it's personal information, I'm going to go use their credit to go buy things and sell it for money. If it's medical information, I'm going to commit medical fraud. If it's payroll information, I'm going to go commit tax fraud. Most of these things can be monetized pretty directly. If it's access, I can drop ransomware. And so credentials are extremely common in letting the attackers in. And so what we need to do about them is, well, two-factor authentication. So one of my people I was doing an interview for this DBIR, like we're chatting, before the podcast starts up. And he goes, the DBIR is kind of an ad for two-factor authentication, isn't it? And I'm like, yes, it very much is. Because it's one of those things that is very, very important because credentials are so important. But I say that knowing that it is not easy. Like it's easy to say all these things we should be doing or that our organization should be doing, as if like you just snap your fingers and it happens. In reality, if you're a small organization, maybe you can turn on two-factor authentication on the cloud service, but then you have to worry about maybe it didn't get applied to the legacy services, IMAP and POP3, and so you got to check that out. And you turned it on and your organization is not particularly IT savvy, and so now you have to reset everyone's two-factor authentication every week, and this is on top of all the other things you do as an IT person within a small organization, and it's a big burden. If you're in a large organization, maybe you have dedicated resources for it, but now you have to go, does anyone really remember how the VPN concatenator works? Because like some guy set that up like 10 years ago and no one's touched it since then. And we've got this huge complex single sign-on that this has to work with, and on top of that, we've got all the other infrastructure. It's hard. All of these things are hard work within our organizations. And so it's important then that we dedicate the resources to the things that happen most often, these four things, the four horsemen, and that we then go and look at the other things, and that we also appreciate the people who do them and understand how much effort they're putting in to make the security work so that we don't just say, hey, turn on two-factor authentication. Oh, yeah, sure, that happens just magically. Additionally, for passwords, there's a couple other things we can do in our organizations. Encourage password management. Encourage people to use password managers, right? Because it's password reuse that is leading to this. And so when people use password managers, they don't reuse their passwords as much. Also, have a same password policy, right? NIST now has pretty reasonable recommendations. Don't be the organization that requires people to change their passwords. So here it is. This is my corporate iPhone. I just got it recently, and I put a good password on it. And then after 3 months, it asked me to change it. The PIN on my iPhone PIN is now 2019-01-ish, something like that. And the next one's going to be 2019-02. It is no longer a good PIN because I am not willing to come up with a good PIN every 3 months. Your employees are the same way. Set them up for success. And finally, you can look at services that provide access to existing passwords, password dumps, so that you can look to see if passwords are in a breach. The attackers are using the same sources of dump data as we are, and so if you can go look to see if your passwords have been breached, that's an opportunity to clean up potentially compromised passwords in your environment. So, and by the way, that was the 85%. Right, which obviously leaves the other 15%, the advanced attacks, the ones that are fun to talk about. And they follow, we're going to talk about them a itty bitty bit, but not a lot, because they follow kind of a standard process. They're normally external, motivated by espionage. They follow this kind of chain of social attacks leading to malware, leading to hacking, leading to compromise of internal information or secrets. The interesting thing in that, though, is that they're starting in the same place. They're starting with social attacks. And more so social than credentials, because if you're committing an advanced attack, particularly a targeted attack, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to target a specific organization. And you're not going to get that by just buying bulk credentials. And so the next easiest thing is phishing. The advanced attackers are just like every other attacker. They want to find the easiest way to get their job done and then go home and barbecue. They're going to follow the same process. They're not using some crazy way to get in the majority of the time, particularly when something like phishing works. So I told you I would apologize for these charts here. This is where I only kind of do it. It's like one of those like half apologies, like I'm sorry I didn't do as good a job explaining this as I could have. But I am going to try to explain this here. So the way you read these charts, these are the steps an attack takes. And so every path through here is a breach. And you don't read this the way you would read a book. You read it kind of more like artwork, in that each of these is like a story of an individual breach. And what you want to do is not just get the individual stories, you want to get the overarching theme, the narrative. And what we're looking at is the number of steps that the attack took from starting here to the end of the attack, right here at 0 steps. We had one that was 14 steps, one that was 12, and the majority are short attacks, and we'll talk about that later. The lines all start at the action. So you see all the brown ones up here start at the same spot. Those are all the attacks that started with social. These down here are attacks that started with error. You can see they're all short. And then it bounces back and forth between the attribute compromised. And so this one was a hacking attack that compromised integrity, followed by confidentiality, and then integrity, and then malware, and it bounces back and forth. This one started with a social attack, compromising integrity, and then compromising confidentiality, and confidentiality again. You get the point. Now, I want to look at the most common attacks in the long paths first. These are the 15% of advanced attacks. And one of the things we see, kind of the narrative, is that there's a lot of hacking and a lot of malware in here. And a lot of them start with social, but they're the longer social. And so these are the attacks that started with phishing and a social attack that led to then hacking and malware being dropped in that advanced attack. And this is going to be the first, I nearly got caught there. This is going to be a first of our defensive opportunities around paths. So the first defensive opportunity around paths is to pick where you want to meet the attacker. And this is nice, right? Because if you stop thinking about breaches as like a point in time, and you start thinking about the steps, you can start saying, where do I want to address this attacker? I think they kind of talked about something like this in the keynote a little bit. You don't have, the attacker takes steps. And we've all heard the saying, the attacker has to be right once, we have to be right all the time. And then the corollary to that, obviously, is the attacker has to complete every one of their steps correctly. We only have to stop one of their steps. And so you could say, maybe I want to stop that first phishing attack. Or maybe I want to stop the malware internally. Or maybe I want to stop that hacking action as they pivot internally. Or maybe I want to try to address them in all these places. Or maybe I want to address as this data leaves. You can start picking where you want to stop the attack if you think in terms of paths. Now, on the other side, when we look at the short paths, we start to see the things that we talked about before. Right? There's a lot of error. Look, that's the brown ones down here. There's a lot of social and misuse. And the social here, like the financially motivated social engineering attacks, and a lot of hacking, and this is use of stolen credentials. And so we see a lot of that, as well as physical attacks that normally are short as well. And this kind of brings us to the second point about paths. We see that the attackers like short paths. The majority of attacks are 1 or 2 or 3 steps. And the reason they like that is because when it starts to get out to 5 steps or 10 or 15 steps, the attack is a lot less likely to succeed. This is breach data, and this is simulated breach data from a company that simulates breaches. And so this brings us to our second point. Try to lengthen the attack path for the attackers. Add steps. So who here was at DerbyCon this year? A few people. Was anyone at the laser grid thing that they were jumping through? Oh, no. Did anyone see the pictures of people jumping through the laser grid? Yeah, there we go. So they had the competition, and they had this laser grid. And they've got some really good pictures of these big dudes diving through the lasers. But you can think about that as another step in the path the attackers had to take. And even in that weird kind of silly situation, I think they said that maybe half of people failed to get through it. And so, what would it take for you from a control standpoint to filter out half of all attacks? That sounds like a pretty good deal, particularly if it's even a simple control. And I mean, that's half, right? Look at something like two-factor authentication, where none of us believe that two-factor authentication is perfect. There are always ways to defeat two-factor authentication, no matter what kind it is. But it's another step in that path. It lengthens the attack for the attacker. And the attackers don't like long paths. And if two-factor authentication filters out 90% of the attacks, that's a huge improvement. That leaves a tenth of the work for your ops team that would have had otherwise. And so try to lengthen the attack path for the attackers, because the 85% of attackers want the short path. We're going to move on? Yeah, there we go. And then the third point is shown here. And so these are the actions that happen in breaches. These are the actions that happen at the beginning of breaches. These are the actions that happen in the middle. And these are the ones at the end. And by the way, obviously for a short breach, like a breach that's one step, the beginning is the same as the end. There is no middle. So there is a little overlap between these. And the interesting thing about these charts is that the point is not the top, it's the bottom. Well, I need to step back. I'm getting too close to the microphones. At the bottom, we see that the least likely action to start a breach is malware. And no one here is going to give me brownie points for pointing out that malware has to come from somewhere. Yeah, intuitively that makes sense now that you think about it, but how often do we think about that in a breach or in an incident where we say, hey, I see malware? That clearly means I need to look backwards in time. I'm thinking in terms of a path. I need to look back in the path. On the other hand, it is very common in the middle, and so we can say that this breach is going somewhere. In fact, social is the least likely thing to happen at the end of a breach. So if you're seeing a social attack, that means you need to look forward for where the attacker is going. And this brings us to our third point for defensive ideas around paths. Based off of what you see, you can guess at what you don't see. If you see malware, you can guess that you haven't seen things before. If you see social, you can guess that you haven't seen things after. You have the opportunity to work through and more granularly understand what's happening in your system and what you don't see based off of what you see. And so this is an interesting one. So normally when we talk about breaches, we would all think that the breach starts when the attacker starts messing with us and ends when the actions on target cease. That's kind of where we mentally define kind of the boundaries for a breach. But how often do we really seriously think about what happens before the breach and what happens after the breach? And that was one of the things that I kind of wanted to explore in the DBR this year. And so we collected some data from criminal forums and marketplaces. And I'm expecting the Amazon of evil, you can put in that I want ransomware, and it gives you a nice thing, and it says star ratings on all of it, some good comments and feedback. I'm expecting this nice set of things. It's nothing like that. It's like watching 15-year-olds chat on Halo. It is much lower level of discourse, so to speak. In fact, we'd already put in filters to try to get down to just the security-related stuff, and still just drugs, lots and lots of drugs. That's what criminal forums. And so when you hear darknet, don't think masterminds of evil. Think like the guy down the street trying to get his weed. It's not that bad. And what is there was very much credit card related, because I expected to see a lot of trade in malware or stuff in the tool chain for attacks. And that's not what I saw. I saw mostly credit card trading and other things around bank accounts. And there's a little bit of other things related to it, but it's mostly here in this cluster around that. The only other cluster was around accounts. And so things like VPN and proxy accounts, which the attackers use in part of their attacks, but also not listed here are video service accounts, both the legitimate kind that you and your spouse share, and then the more adult kind. Those were traded a lot as well. And then the one thing that isn't listed in here is there's a lot of cell phone cells. And so we saw lots and lots of messages buying or selling cell phones. And that tends to be one of two things. It's it can be multiple things. So a lot of times it's people that are selling illegitimately gotten cell phones as a way of cashing out their crime, but it's also people that are buying cell phones as a way of laundering money that they've gotten illegitimately. And then some of it is even just normal cell phone sales. But these are the things that are happening. It's not like this, incredible criminal architecture. And so after looking at that, we wanted to look at what happened after the breach. And we went to the FBI IC3, the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center, and got data from them. And for those that don't know, you can go and report. They have a nice, simple website where if you have a breach or an incident, you go and you report what happened. And they at least collected and maybe are able to help you as well. And what we found is that the majority of breaches weren't particularly expensive. You didn't have a lot stolen by the attacker. It's like $8,000 or $24,000. That's like the cost of my car at $8,000 or the cost of my wife's car at $24,000. She has the nice van, and as a complete aside, I love driving a minivan. It's so much nice. There's room in the back. It's was not something I expected. The attackers aren't taking a lot of money. And so where are the costs from the breaches coming from? If you go back and look at the 2016 report, one of the things you'll find is that the majority of the costs for breaches come from outside legal assistance or IR. And both of those apply even if your breach came from an error that you made. You still have to do the legwork. And so if you're planning to secure your system and planning to decrease the cost of breach, one, you can't ignore errors, and two, you need to plan to deal with IR and with legal and have contracts in place to minimize those costs because the attackers aren't always taking that much money. Now, obviously, the caveat is that there's as many breaches between the median and 100 million as there are between a median and zero, so there are some big ones in there. Now, the other part of this is that when the IC3 recovery asset team acts upon a business email compromise and works with the destination bank, half of all US-based business email compromise victims had 99% of the money recovered or frozen, and only 9% had nothing recovered. And that frozen is frozen so that they could go back and get it back from the bank. And what this means is that even if you've had the money stolen, there's still a chance to get it back. That money went somewhere. It went to a bank, and banks in general act normally. And so if you report quickly, one, it's possible the FBI will be able to help you, but there is a chance. Don't give up just because the money is left. Go after it. See what else you can do. Don't let the breach just be the end of it. And so now I'm going to talk about industries. And for the industries, the reality is none of you care about more than one of these industries. And so I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, try to hit the high points for each, and not make you wait through the other 8 industries that you care absolutely nothing about. So this is going to go relatively quickly. We are going to show the common paths for each industry, or the paths for it, and then the most common path. Here in accommodation and food services, you can see that malware and hacking tend to be very common, and that's actually part of the theme for this industry. Their most common path is hacking leading to a breach of confidentiality, or hacking leading to malware, and malware leading to a breach of confidentiality. And the reason is because accommodations and food services has a profound problem with point-of-sale breaches and point-of-sale malware. I don't know why it is that this industry gets targeted this way, but I even saw one this morning where a major food chain, in fact, I think 3 major chains, had their point-of-sale systems for about a year compromised with point-of-sale malware, which obviously steals credentials. And it always gets caught by fraud detection. It's the credit card companies coming back and telling them, hey, we noticed that credit cards that were only used at your organization tend to be breached, and so we think you have a problem. So if you're in accommodation and food sales, you need to do a better job of protecting point-of-sale devices, and 2, work on detection, because detection is all happening externally. When detection happens externally, by that time, the attack is over and gone. The damage is done. Next, we'll move on to education, which is a lot funner. They've got a lot more diversity in what happens. But their most common breach is something you're going to see a lot of, which is error leading to breaches of confidentiality. And this is going to repeat a lot because it's a short path and a straightforward path. Now, they have an interesting case where 35% of breaches were due to human error, but they also had a substantial amount of espionage. However, it's going down. It used to be 43%, now it's 12. On the other side, financial is going up in education. And one of the things we didn't see this year that we saw last year, does anyone remember like the W-2 breaches? Like the attackers would steal W-2 forms in January and then go and cash them out through tax fraud. And for some reason, that just didn't really happen this year. I don't know if it's the threat actor, gave up or got caught or, retired, but we didn't see it both here and in manufacturing where it was very big a year or two ago. Moving on to finance and insurance, and this is one of the major trends that we saw, which was really interesting. Again, their most common breach was errors leading to breaches of confidentiality. But they had a lot of breaches of financial credentials. And this data is part of our breach corpus, but it's analyzed separately because if you take 2,000 breaches from everything else and add it to 50,000 breaches of botnets, all your data is about the botnets. And so we analyze them separately, and one of the things we find is that the vast majority are related to financial institutions with a significant amount still of information organizations and professional organizations. But what this means in combination with this is that the attackers are going after accounts, they're not going after payment data. This is credit card breaches in financial institutions like skimmers on ATMs and such. The attackers aren't going after the payment cards in financial institutions anymore. That's going down. Instead, they're going after the credentials. That's going up. And so if you're in a financial organization, you have to be prepared to protect your customers and protect your customers' accounts because that's what the attackers are coming after. Moving on to healthcare, and healthcare is always a really fun one because healthcare has they have like a little city, right? They've got the medical side, but then they've got the utilities side, and they've got the finance side, and they've got the retail side, and they've got the accommodation side, and they've got like this little city of all different things mixed together. And because they have mandatory reporting, errors leading to a breach of confidentiality is again their most common path. But they have something that no other industry has. They have more insiders than they have external actors. Anyone want to take a guess why? What? Disgruntled? No, but I will give you a book for actually answering the question. I really appreciate it. It is so nice when people will answer questions because that helps and we get to think about it. And what's happening here, it's very similar to that, but it's almost the opposite. It's fun. The attack, it's internal actors that go and look at data a lot of times and go, hey, I want to go look up how someone someone was in the news, and so I go look up someone's medical record, and that's a breach. It's also healthcare people who want to make a little extra money on the side, so they steal some healthcare records and pass it to their friend who knows some people, and it becomes healthcare fraud. In fact, we were coding one. So I stream on Twitch, by the way, like Tuesdays and Thursdays, turning news reports into structured data, if you ever want to watch it. And one of the ones we did this week is 3 guys that were caught. They still had logins to their former healthcare institutions where they had worked. They were logging in, stealing healthcare information, and turning around and filing fraudulent Medicare reimbursements with it. And that kind of thing happens all the time. And so it's that kind of misuse paired with the mandatory reporting of errors that lead to breaches, right? Because if you send someone's medical data, person A's medical data to person B, that's reportable. If you accidentally leak 50 records of medical data, that's really reportable. And so those kinds of things cause internal actors to be more common than external actors in healthcare. That said, I expect healthcare also has a ransomware issue. Over 70% of malware in healthcare is ransomware. And so it doesn't show up in the breach data because ransomwares rarely breach data, but it is a significant trend in healthcare as well. So moving on to information, all the tech companies, right? If you're in Salesforce and you pull the pull down and it's got technology, that's these companies, because historically our industry classification systems don't have a technology option, so they all kind of end up in information. And information companies, again, are a little bit distributed. Social and hacking, a little more technical in the attacks. But again, their most common breach is related to errors leading to confidentiality because, again, they're using lots of services that it's easy to misconfigure. They've got a lot of space to cause errors. Now, the interesting thing here is errors are the most common thing, but there's a very high amount of espionage. And the errors cause the internal attackers to be pretty high, and that's due to all the misconfiguration, so cloud services exposed to the internet or databases exposed to the internet. But they also have a huge amount of espionage. 29% of breaches were related to espionage and information. 22% of breaches leaked secrets. And so information tech companies need to be worried about espionage. And manufacturing is a weird one because they're the ones that are not really on the internet, right? The manufacturing companies have the one web page from 1995 that's static and basically says nothing about them because that's not how they do business. And so we kind of wonder, how do they become breaches? It's not like they're exposing a bunch of cloud services. It's not like, they're, doing a lot of work through their online presence. But they do have a lot of things to lose. And so their most common path is actually misuse, leading to confidentiality. I kind of suspect it's because they don't have that internet presence. But the interesting thing is they're becoming much more financially motivated. Traditionally, it was espionage, corporate espionage that led to breaches. But over the last 2 years, we've seen a transition to financial. And like I said before, we didn't see the W-2 breaches that we saw, but I really kind of expect that the value that a manufacturing organization will bring to attackers is going to be a lot of times in the workers they employ. And so if you have a lot of staff, you have a lot of healthcare records, you have a lot of tax records, you have a lot of personal information. And all those things can be directly turned into money. What it is not normally is it's not normally attacking the systems on the manufacturing floor. That's the cool breach is, the breach that takes over the robotic arm and grabs someone and throws them across the room. But that's not what really happens. It's hard to make money on that. And so the attackers are really not going after that. Maybe we would see ransomware in that, but I think that there's a general awareness about security and OT that we're going to try to track OT a little better. But I suspect that the majority of breaches we will find will not be OT related as we get better at tracking OT versus IT security. Moving on to professional and technical services. Who here is a consultant? Yeah, this is y'all. This is all the people doing services when I did actual engineering. My background is an electrical engineer. This was me. And it's kind of a nice diverse structure, but still errors leading to breaches of confidentiality are the most common path. And here we had lots and lots of business email compromises, right? This is I'm not really sure why, but this is where we saw executives being breached. This is where we saw fraudulent transactions. So the CFO being told by a fake CEO account to go transfer money, and the CFO transfers money. Those were up 18 times from last year. They were 1% of breaches here last year, and they're 22% this year. This is an area where we need to worry. There's a lot of pretexting. The financial staff are the ones targeted. There's use of stolen credentials because if you're going to compromise an email for a business email compromise, you got to compromise the email. And a lot of it's executive staff being targeted because those are the ones that can transfer the money. Now we're down to 2 industries. Thank you for, if you've seen your industry already, for waiting through all the others. Public administration and retail. Public administration, error is their most common path because they have mandatory reporting, but the interesting thing is here. The big uptick in espionage this year was related to public administration. And the scary thing is that over half of breaches took years to detect. That, now just think about your organization. If the majority of breaches you detected took at least a year to detect, how would you come out on your performance forum, right? This is not a story we want to be telling. On the other hand, it might indicate something good. Maybe we stepped it up in public administration and we're catching those old breaches now, and that's why it's coming in the data this way. Regardless, if you're in public administration, you need to be worried about espionage, and we need to see improvement in our detection. And finally, retail, which is one of the funner stories from the report. Here, physical breaches leading to breaches of confidentiality and integrity are the most common. But we saw this interesting switch because we saw point of sale breaches, so non-web app servers are card present, are going down. The attackers aren't attacking the point of sale in retail as much anymore. Instead, they're attacking online payment, card not present, and web app server-based breaches. And the this is our breach data. This is data from the NCFTA. And there's a couple of things that could be leading to this, right? The shift to chip and signature in the US is probably part of it. And our data set tends to be kind of US biased. By the way, if you know international sources, we'd love to try to get a very holistic view internationally. So come see me afterwards, tell me about organizations that might help my international corpus. Also, we saw vulnerabilities in retail payment card online services, right? There was a software package that had a vulnerability that was remotely exploitable that caused a lot of breaches. And finally, we didn't have any of the breaches that breached like a point of sale system. So what happens is you have the point of sale company, and they've got a bunch of customers, and then they get breached, and then the attackers use that to breach every one of the customers underneath them, and that becomes a lot of point of sale breaches in retail. And we didn't have any of those last year, but we had one that came in after the report got done this year. I'll have time for questions afterwards. And so that's the last industry, but this is where this gets to be kind of an interesting point. This is where we have to step back and have the discussion about, what are you willing to do to balance cost and risk? Because there's really kind of three types of organizations. The first type are going to be the kind that can't afford to mitigate even the basics. So I live in this little 3-stoplight town, right? My liquor store, their point of sale device is leased. They don't own it. My dentist, he owns his computers, but he doesn't own the software on them. He's leasing that. And so what they have the opportunity is they're taking advantage of the economies of scale because their point of sale vendor can then hire a NOC or hire an MSSP that then manages all the point of sale systems. And if you're a small organization, you don't really have a lot of opportunity. You can't buy your own NOC. You need to invest in a service that can. Now, where I suspect the majority of us stand is in this area, kind of the medium area. We can invest in security. And so, who here remembers the 4 horsemen? Someone that hasn't answered before. You, sir, black shirt, red, middle. Where are the 4? In front of you. Beard, bald beard. Yeah, you. Okay. Next. Yes, ma'am. Phishing, errors, social, and creds. Perfect. Here. I brought 1 copy of the printed report. I get 6 of these things a year. And so there's one of mine. You need to address these things first. Patching known external vulnerabilities, especially the old and easy ones. Prepare for graceful degradation when errors occur. Protect against financially motivated social engineering attacks and phishing. And defend against credential theft, 2-factor authentication, and the other tools. And that's kind of the obvious thing, but then the question becomes, what do you do after that? And I think the problem is a lot of us say, well, now I need to go after those advanced threats. And this is where it gets complicated. Because after you've taken care of the threats that are that only have are one-trick ponies, then the threats can pivot. And if the threats can pivot, they can take advantage of any problem you have. And if they can do that, you have to stop everything. And so now instead of 5 mitigations, you need 25 mitigations to stop them. And so the question is, are you going to invest in that entire additional 20 mitigations as an organization and do them all well? And if you're not, it may be a good idea to stop at the 4 and take the extra InfoSec money you have and put it into your ops team and trying to deal with the places that your 4 mitigations fall down because, right, nothing's perfect. And so you can use ops to help deal with that. And then, to deal with the advanced threats, you really just need to know your local chapter of national law enforcement. They are there to help you in the case of these larger, more complex breaches, and it is much better to know them before the breach than after. On the other hand, if you are that advanced organization, you want to stop the advanced attack, you need to be prepared to spend a lot and to lose a lot. Because you're no longer playing in the minor leagues. You're spinning like blank check, right? There's some of the big companies give their security department a blank check. And we're not talking like small blank check, we're talking really big blank check. You need to be prepared to make profound changes across your organization. It's Google changing all of their services to the zero trust model to basically segment all of their users off from all of their services. You know, you need to be prepared to do that. It's like the minor league team going up and playing the majors, and you're going to lose a lot. You're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of resources trying to get better, and for a long time it's not going to matter because you have to cut all the paths out until you start winning. And if you're not prepared for that, if you're not willing to do that as an organization, you need to be prepared to just stay at that medium level, and that's okay because you're going to stop the majority of attacks. And so with that, the only thing I want to leave you with is no matter which one you are, it's okay to be small, it's okay to be medium, it's okay to be large, but no matter what you do something. Because you only have to get that itty bitty bit better to get away from the attacker. And so with that, I'll open up to questions. Yes?
Do you have any idea how they're getting that CVD with the requirements of PCI DSS 421,
So on web apps, right, the credit card number has to be put in through the web app. And so if there's malware on the website, they're going to get it that way. Point of sale devices are still scanning, particularly like accommodations, they're still scanning mag strips. And if you're scanning mag strips and you're reading memory, if you don't have an advanced mag strip reader that encrypts at the reader, you're going to get it. And so do I know whether these organizations are following PCI well? I would have to go back and look. We've got some of that in our data, but it's not something I look at regularly. But I suspect that what it is, they're kind of these traditional ways because if you're using a more advanced processing, we're using chip and SIG, it is less likely. We haven't seen anything that seems to indicate that there was kind of a robust attack on chip-based credit card authentication. Yes, sir. So the question is attempted breaches for utilities. And we do collect that. And we see it's a small sample size, and due to some statistical reasons, we have traditionally not been able to report on it. We are making changes to our process to be able to talk about it, at least in a statistical manner. But the story is generally that it's not the OT systems, or if it is the OT system, it's the HMI, the human-machine interface, and it's the normal attack processes. I don't doubt that there are nation states, and there's probably a few of them in our data set, they're making these minor, actually attacking the embedded systems, but the vast majority of even industry or utilities type breaches are like phishing on the HMI. Why people are opening emails on the HMI, I don't know, but it happens. Any other questions? Two more questions? Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
How are they being monetized? They need no obligation actually against the actual folder, or are they being involved in like money scams through ACH?
My understanding is that normally it's them just logging in and emptying out the bank account. In most of the cases that we've looked at directly, but that doesn't mean that the other things don't happen because of the way the data comes in. The monetization may not have been explicitly written down. Yes, and our data lags by obviously roughly a year. And so shifts in the last couple of weeks or couple of months won't be captured. And the reality is we've seen some really interesting trends. Subjectively, we've seen trends in the last couple of months that I expect to show up in our data this year to make the 2020 report have some interesting changes from the 2019 report. And so it's been fun kind of seeing these potential trends show up, and I'm excited to see if they actually show up when I look at my data as an aggregate set. Any other questions? Am I missing anyone? I don't see one, so thank you.